I never believed in ghosts until I met one. Bedtime is supposed to be a comforting routine, right? For most kids, it's just a part of the day where you settle down, maybe listen to a bedtime story, and drift off to sleep. But for me, bedtime was terrifying. Even now, thinking about those nights sends a chill down my spine. It all started when I got my own room. I was about 8 years old, and my brother, who's 5 years older, finally got his wish for a space of his own. So, I ended up in a small, narrow room at the back of our house. It wasn't a big deal. I understood that we didn't have a lot of space, and it was just part of growing up. I was given the bunk beds that my brother and I used to share, and while I missed having him around, I was kind of excited about having the top bunk to myself. I remember lying on the top bunk, staring down at my toys scattered across the floor, trying to ignore the strange sensation that something was wrong. My eyes kept being drawn to the bottom bunk, like there was something there just out of sight. But every time I looked directly at it, there was nothing, just an empty, neatly made bed. That night, I fell asleep with the sounds of my parents' TV in the background, feeling safe because they were still awake, but then something woke me up. At first, I couldn't figure out what it was. The room was pitch black, with just a sliver of light from outside highlighting the outlines of my furniture. Then I heard a faint rustling sound. It took me a few seconds to realize that it was the sound of bed sheets moving, like someone was trying to get comfortable in the bottom bunk. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Maybe my cat had snuck into the room when my mom came to check on me, and it had settled in the bottom bunk. But then I noticed that the door was closed just as it had been when I fell asleep. There was no way the cat had gotten in. The rustling stopped as soon as I moved, and for a moment, I thought I'd scared the cat or whatever it was. But then, the bottom bunk started shaking violently, as if someone or something was thrashing around down there. My heart pounded in my chest, and fear gripped me in a way I'd never experienced before. I did what any scared kid would do. I screamed for my mom. I could hear her stirring from across the house, and I felt a wave of relief. But before she could reach me, the bed started shaking even harder, slamming against the wall as if it was possessed. I was too scared to climb down, afraid that whatever was in the bottom bunk would grab me. Finally, the door burst open, and my mom rushed in, flooding the room with light. The shaking stopped immediately. The bottom bunk was empty, just as it had been when I went to bed. I was crying, terrified, but I didn't tell her what had happened. My mom stayed in the bottom bunk that night, promising she'd be there until morning. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep, but I woke up several times to the sound of those damned rustling sheets. The next day, I did everything I could to stay out of that room. I played outside with my friends, trying to forget what had happened. But every time I glanced at that small, ordinary window of my room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was in there, watching, waiting for nightfall. When bedtime rolled around again, I didn't protest. I didn't even try to make an excuse to sleep in my parents' room. I just climbed up to the top bunk and lay there, waiting for the inevitable. Part of me hoped that it had all been a nightmare, but deep down, I knew better. The rustling started again, just as it had the night before. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, trying to convince myself that it was just the wind or maybe the house settling. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A slow, rasping breath coming from the bottom bunk. It was like something was down there, lying in wait, breathing heavily as if it was tired or sick. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that it would go away, but the breathing only got louder, more labored. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest, and then the bed started shaking again. This time, I knew I couldn't just scream for my mom. I had to face whatever it was that was haunting me. But the fear was overwhelming, suffocating. I could barely move, barely breathe, and then I felt it. The thing from the bottom bunk was climbing up to the top. I could feel the mattress compress under its weight, feel the cold, clammy air as it breathed down my neck. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. I was too scared to even make a sound. As it climbed up, I felt something cold and smooth brush against my shoulder. I didn't want to look, didn't want to see what it was, but I couldn't help it. I turned my head slightly and saw it an arm, pale and thin, reaching out from under the blanket. I don't know how I managed to do it, but I bolted. I jumped out of the bed and ran for the door, slamming it behind me as I sprinted down the hall to my parents' room. I didn't stop running until I was in their bed, shaking uncontrollably. They never understood why I was so scared, why I refused to sleep in that room ever again. I couldn't tell them I was too afraid that if I did, whatever it was would come back. Eventually, my parents moved me into another room and the nightly visits stopped. But I'll never forget what happened in that tiny, narrow room at the back of our house. Even now, as an adult, I can't sleep in complete darkness. I always need some kind of light, just in case. So, there it is. Make of it what you will. Maybe it was just a nightmare, or maybe there really was something lurking in that room. All I know is that I've never been more scared in my life, and I don't think I ever will be again. Like and follow Tale Blueprints for more interesting stories.